Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome on this webinar on the impacts of the COVID-19 on the energy sector. And this webinar is organized by ERRA. So I am FAUCHEUX. I am currently commissioner at the French Regulation Agency for Energy. And I will introduce briefly this webinar with first a short presentation of ERRA. ERRA is an association of a regulatory agency for regulatory cooperation in the energy sector. It was last year the 20th anniversary of ERRA. The Energy Regulators Regional Association is a voluntary organization comprising independent energy regulatory body from everywhere in the world, mainly Europe, Africa, but also Middle East, South, North America. And the purpose and objective of this association is to improve national energy regulation in member countries. It fosters development of stable energy regulator scheme with autonomy and authority. It improves cooperation among energy regulators with outstanding training. I experienced one of the training last year. It's good training, and it facilitates the exchange of information, research, training, experience among members and other regulators around the world. And the exchange of information is the purpose of today's webinar. The ERRA members, there is 34 full members and 14 associate members, and as you can see, it covers all the world, and as I told you, mainly Europe, Africa, in America also, and some countries in Southeast Asia. Thailand just joined ERRA quite recently. So the webinar of today will be dealing with the impact of the COVID-19 on the energy sector. It has been a huge and tremendous crisis that has struck our economy. And recently, the Association of European Energy Regulators have committed a draft report. The report is still drafted, so it's not published today, about what was the impact of the COVID-19 sector. I will present you rapidly, the outcome of this project. And then I will introduce you to the panel of speakers that will make a presentation for around 10 to 15 minutes. And then we will have a Q&A session after each presentation. Only the presentation between Mr. Guyon and Mr. Bart will be joined, and also the presentation between Mr. MWONDHA and Mr. ROUGUET will also be joined because they are dealing with the same topics. So there is currently a Council of European Energy Regulator called CEER, who is drafting a report on the COVID-19 impact on the energy sector. So as I show you, this is still a work in progress. So I will present you first findings. First findings for suppliers. First of all, the full impact is not yet clear. And I think that Ms. Guyon will show you that there is some first outcome, but we don't know what the future will be for the supplier. Several regulatory agencies have reported an increase in unpaid energy bill linked with COVID and not linked with COVID. You know, nobody is really eager to pay his bill. So we don't know if there are really a COVID deep impact on unpaid bill or if it's just an alibi. And then there have been measures taken to support suppliers with staggering and deferral of network tariff bills in some countries. Network operators, how have been them impacted by COVID? Some regulators have already anticipated or reported a slight decrease in tariff revenue, but mainly network operators are covered for their cost. So as to say, there is for them sort of insurance that they will recover a partial shock. But if the shock of the COVID is a long-term shock, then the question is quite different. There are delays to network development and smart meter rollout due to lockdown measure. And then most agencies, most regulators have not yet taken measure to support network operators because it has not been seen as a force majeure measure. For consumer, many countries had some of disconnection moratorium in place, and this is quite standard because a lot of people are using energy for their primary needs. Also, among the first finding, among the lessons learned from the regulator, there is a good resilience of the energy sector. We have to see, there is a fact that the energy network has not crashed down. There has not been a sort of huge problem in the energy sector. But there was also a great challenge. It was ensuring good and swift information flows between all stakeholders. The liberalization of the energy sectors has led to have several actors on several rows or several stakes. And then the information flow and the fact that the information was rapid was really crucial. The ERRA have adapted procedure on deadline when necessary that prevented disconnection of consumer. And two last first lessons which are crucial. First of all is that the burden of the crisis has been heavily taken by suppliers. And then there is a question mark. Is this normal that suppliers have taken so much of the burden of the COVID-19 crisis? And then remote operation and digitalization have become really crucial in this crisis to cope with the all-today operation. Next step, there will be a publication of the report in March, I hope. And this is Jean-Laurent Lastel with my colleague at the Council of European Energy Regulators, with actively acting for finalizing this report. So as soon as the report will be published, I think we will send you an information. A brief introduction to the debate, because the key point is to give the floor to our panelists. Impact on the energy system. We can say that there has been a fairly huge impact, a big shock, but a shock which was very temporary. We have seen 15 decrease in consumption of electricity and 15 to 20% decrease in gas and energy consumption. But there is an uncertainty about the fact that this decrease is a long-term decrease or only a short-term decrease, and then there will be back to the normal. So what are the real issues? Short-term effect? Are the impacts on energy global consumption the real problem? Is the resilience of the energy system sufficient to face brutal consumption changes? So to say it in other words, we say that the energy system has been resilient, but what lesson do we have to learn from this shock? Midterm effect. The production has been disorganized in some countries. So what will be the next step? There is uncertainty on markets, and then how the price formation is affected in the long term, how the investor in the energy system will react to the uncertainty created by the COVID-19 crisis. And then oil and gas has been more affected than electricity. Exxon reported a 22 billion loss in 2020, and this is the biggest loss affecting a company listed. So this is a real concern of a shift between oil and electricity. And then there is a long-term effect. This is the dilemma: save my life today or save my planet later. So is there a backward effect in the energy transition? And then the economic crisis is mainly supported by public spending. Is this on the long run affordable? Can we have in the long run a lack of public spendings, and then will be the energy sector, which is generally speaking heavily taxed. Will the energy sector be affected by the fact that there will be a need to recover the public accounts? The first two presentations are from Julia GUYON, which she is working at the International Energy. And to present her very quickly, she is a brilliant energy engineer. So in the energy field, there is a lot of engineers. And she worked in Germany and in France in the energy sector. And the last, her main stack was a compilation of the energy statistics for China, Indonesia, and several Asian and Latin American. And she will present us the last study and last report, last data on energy consumption around the world. And then Bart STOFFER will then make a presentation about the energy consumption pattern with a focus on some countries and with a more dedicated view on what happened on this country. He is 27 years old professional of the energy sector, and he is working since 4 years at DNV. He is graduated from an engineer MSc. So as to say, the world of energy is made by a lot of engineers. Julia, I will leave you the floor. And if you have any question arising around during these two presentations, do not hesitate to put your question in the chat function of this webinar. Thank you very much. And Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yvan, and thank you for the introduction. Welcome everyone to this webinar. I will try to introduce the topic of the impact of COVID-19 on global energy demand by showing some of the findings of our analysis on the COVID-19 data impact on the global energy system. I am an energy data manager at the International Energy Agency, and I've worked, as Yvan mentioned, mostly on Asia and Latin America. And here on our COVID-19 impact work, I've led the work on China as well. So, for the context, the current COVID-19 pandemic is first and foremost a global health crisis. As you all know, we've been dealing with this now for over a year. We have, as of yesterday, when I have last looked, more than 100 million cases confirmed. We have more than 2 million deaths reported. So it's a really global epidemic, and governments' responses have been in the same scale, very drastic, especially at the beginning. We see this very well when we look at the Universities of Oxford's government stringency index, which you see here represented on the screen. We have the United States in the top left. If I move to the right, I have India, Germany, Israel, and in the second row, Brazil, China, Italy, and South Africa. What you see is an index that goes from 0 to 100, 0 being no government response, so no measures to restrict the spread of the virus, 100 being the strictest measures. We see here that starting in March, April, most of the governments actually really reacted strongly, going to indexes of 80, sometimes even 100 for the case of India, Italy. So the pattern globally is that government really took very strong measures to try to avoid the spread of the virus, and this, of course, impacted strongly the energy system. And that's what we will see now. So first, looking overall at the energy demand, this is the change in global energy demand from 1900 to 2020. We see that there have been some shock waves throughout history. If we look at 2020, we expect that we will have a 6% demand decrease, which is the largest shock in energy demand in over 70 years, and actually way stronger than the one of the financial crisis that is marked in the graph as well. If we look at one of the sectors which was really strongly affected, which is the transport sector, we see here as well the impact of the pandemic was very clear, both in terms of road transport activity, this is the graph on the left, and in terms of the aviation sector, this is the graph on the right, the number of flights. In all the cases, we have first a very strong decrease in China, which was the first affected by the pandemic. So in January, February, really strong decreases here, and then followed by the other countries, India, United States, Europe, the whole world in black represented here in February, March, April being really the strongest times of the pandemic. The global oil demand is very strongly correlated to the transport sector, and the transport sector actually represents 60% of global oil demand in the world. So these decreases have, of course, also have a very strong decreasing impact on the global oil demand. Looking now at electricity, which is going to be my main focus for this presentation. We also had a swift and deep change in electricity consumption in those first months and in those first days after the lockdown was implemented in countries. This is for Europe, the change in electricity demand from the day lockdown began. We see a very strong demand decrease for all the European countries represented, hereby service-based economies, were a bit more affected than industry, than some that had more industry, because industry often continued production and thereby trying to protect their workers. India has as well implemented a very strong lockdown, which is why we see a very strong change in electricity demand. And in China, we have only monthly data, that's why you will see those plateaus. We also had a strong impact in those first days of the lockdown. Looking now at the whole picture, we have February, we are now able to have a look at the whole 2020. We see, this is for the European countries, again, the change in demand. We see that Italy was the strongest affected economy, with change in demand going up to -28%. This is because first it had a very strict lockdown, but also it's a service-based economy. So these two combined created a very strong drop in electricity demand. And we see that for all these countries, the demand returned to 2019 levels gradually until the latest lockdowns. And that's what we see at the end. In November, December, we have the comeback of some lockdowns, of some measures that were often not as drastic as the first measures in the beginning of the year. And so here we see the impact again on energy, on electricity demand. China is thereby really the exception. For China, here you can see also the weather-corrected year-on-year comparison of demand between 2020 and 2019. China is actually the only major economy that will see electricity demand in 2020 higher than in 2019. The drop was quite drastic in the first months, but from April 2020, the Chinese demand actually recovered and ended up towards the end of the year being always at least 6% higher than 2019 levels. But for those that follow the Chinese electricity demand in the past years, it was on average of 6.5%. So this expected growth of around 2% is significantly below the average of the last years. So we still see the impact even on this major economy. Looking now at the energy mix, the global fall in electricity demand, of course, affected generation technologies. And in many markets, what we've seen is that renewables took the market share from combustible electricity sources. And so when electricity demand dropped, really, we saw an increase in renewable power generation. With coal and gas, especially here in the example, this is the United States, especially coal actually really declined in its share and then recovered once lockdown softened. And also in the wake of seasonal decline in wind and hydro, we had a shift back to the use of gas and coal. Looking at the global electricity demand picture in 2020, we expect it to fall by 2% globally, which is the biggest annual decline since the mid-20th century and is larger than the one that followed the global financial crisis, which resulted in a drop in electricity demand of 0.6% in 2009. We are expected to see a great decline in Europe, more than 4%. Demand in France and Germany will drop by around 5%, Italy, United Kingdom, and Spain by around 6% each. And in Asia Pacific, which is together responsible for 48% of the global electricity demand, we have the declines in Japan, in Korea, and India, which are offset by the 2% growth in China that we have mentioned before. We expect the electricity demand to rebound in 2021. Indeed, the demand has almost stagnated in advanced economy in the past 15 years. It was around 0.4% average annual growth in the past. And however, in emerging and developing economies, this picture is very different, with demand increase on average by 5.7% annually. This means that 93% of the worldwide net growth in electricity demand from 2005 to 2019 originated actually from the emerging markets. And therefore, there were 58% that were only from China. In 2020, demand dropped by 3.7% in advanced economies and stagnated in the rest of the world. And we expect in 2021 to have a global increase of demand of around 3%. This would actually lift the 2021 demand above the level of 2019. And as you might imagine, the expected majority of the growth is expected in emerging and developing economies, growing by more than 4%. So this is the right side of the graph. And we expect around 50% of the absolute global growth to happen in China. Looking at the different sources of electricity generation, renewables will continue to grow strongly, even more than the previous year, raising the market share of renewables in 2021 to 29%. But as this will not be enough to offset the growing electricity demand, particularly in the emerging and developing economies, coal is expected to see a very large recovery in absolute terms. But as you can see, we still will end 2021 lower than what was in 2019. For gas, it will hold its own, as will nuclear power. For nuclear power, we will have China and UAE that have new plants that will enter service, which offset retirements in the US and the EU. So in general, the coal generation will recover some of the loss, but not reach the 2019 levels.
Okay, Julia.
Yeah, this is my last slide, actually.
Really last slide, 25 seconds. Sorry.
Okay. Just to mention that at the IA, we will continue collection of real-time data and expanding to try to provide governments and analysts with more information on real-time happenings in the economies. And this is my concluding slide. Basically summing up what I was already mentioning, that we expect global electricity demand in 2020 to fall by around 2%. and China will be the only major economy to see electricity demand in 2020 higher than 2019, whereby renewable electricity generation will grow by 7%, squeezing out conventional generation. We expect electricity demand to rebound modestly in 2021, with both renewables continuing their growth and coal to bounce back. And finally, the IEA will continue to provide analysis. If you want to read more about that, we have the semi-annual electricity market report series, from which the first one was released in December, and the global energy reviews, where a new release is expected in March. And that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Julia, for this overview of the energy consumption around the world. And I will leave the floor to Bart Stoffer, who is going to have a focus on some country. So I already presented Mr. Stoffer. I will not take any time to present the whole career of Mr. Stoffer because we are short of time and there is a quite dense program for today. So Mr. Stoffer, the floor is yours to present us what are the impact of COVID-19 and global power markets, and some, I would say, not only data, but your feeling about what this crisis is going to have on the long-term run on the energy sector.
Right.
Mr. Stoffer?
Thank you very much, Ivan, and thank you very much, Julia. Good morning, everyone. I hope that you can hear me well and see my screen. So, definitely I will add a few more power market and power price related items to Julia's presentation, but obviously, that was an excellent overview, Julia. There are a few slides here about our company. I think you know our company, the Micheal, renewables, and then the energy advisory business. So what we have been doing in 2020 is in March, we of course picked up on the crisis, and we have been analyzing the impact of COVID-19 on the markets in the US, in Europe, and also in Singapore. And I like to throw those three examples, and particularly actually how the crisis actually turned out to be, instead of in comparison to the forecast. So I also a bit highlight let's say the typical issues you have when you are in the forecasting business. We have sophisticated power market models. We look at the fuel markets, but but I will address how our forecasts actually turn out to be. And there's a few links that are downloadable from our website. So in the first place, and I hope that you can see my entire screen, because I think I will take that out. Exactly. Yeah. So when we immediately picked up on the impact of COVID in the US, of course, as Julia said, there was a clear impact on electricity demand resulting from the fact that people started working from home. So we for instance, we analyzed billing data from DSOs, and it also showed that actually residential demand increased slightly. Here on the right side, there's a curve. This is from Consolidated Edison, but it shows that there's significant lower demand in May 2020 versus May 2019. However, residential demand was slightly higher. Also, it resulted in lower electricity prices. There was some impact on thermal capacity additions in the Northeast markets. Recall that particularly in Northeast markets, the lockdown was implemented earlier than, for instance, in Texas. And also, what we immediately saw was as many markets in the US are competitive, you could see there was some opportunistic electricity and natural gas buying to take advantage of the lower wholesale prices. So of course, if you are in a competitive market, you have the ability to mitigate or take mitigation measures against, for instance, price changes, and that's something we saw immediately in the first ways happening. So effectively, there were quite a few buyers who actually benefited from the lower price outlook resulting from COVID. Also, I think it was very impressive, and a report also shows that this is a report we regularly do on the competitive markets in the US. Regulators and regulated utilities immediately responded, and I think that also now, Ivan, you also mentioned that in your opening statements. And now, for instance, to execute programs to assist customers by, who are experiencing financial hardship. And so that it was immediately implemented, and also various regulators, they authorized the creation of a regulated asset, to track the impact of COVID-19 on the cost of regulated utilities. So, overall, a very fast response of the industry, of the regulators on the COVID-19 impact on the sector. But overall, what we've seen in 2020, and this is a kind of summary statement, as we have from our teams in the US, many utilities and suppliers effectively managed to mitigate the loss of load from COVID-19 because they could lock in, lower wholesale prices going forward, so with little mark-to-market impact. And so that is relevant, and it's also relevant for probably other markets which are probably not that competitive, where you are probably more, we have little mitigation options to deal with price changes, and that's something we saw in Singapore. So Singapore, that's a electricity market which, as we say, it operates as a security constrained price-based pool. And it means that generators, they receive the market clearing price, and so that pool is managed, and effectively, and on the right side you see the blue curve. The electricity market clearing price came down significantly in March 2020. Now, most of the generators in Singapore, they are gas-fired, and so the generators, they have long-term contracts on the gas side, and with high take-or-pay levels. So what we saw immediately happening in Singapore, that generators were seeing, on the one hand, lower electricity demand and lower electricity prices, so much lower revenues on the electricity side. At the same time, and forced to still purchase high amounts of gas, and so in the initial impact to the generators in Singapore was quite significant in terms of that the generators were losing money on both sides, right? So can you still see my screen, because I got a few hiccups here? So it is a typical issue, what can happen in a market which is not entirely competitive, and where little options are available to mitigate. However, if we look at the entire year 2020 for Singapore, the impact on the generators did not sustain as drastic as what happened through March, April. And so Singapore managed to keep the pandemic under control. So the economic activity rebounded to a large extent, and also the oil price went back up, meaning that effectively also power prices could bounce back, and that helped generators to offset the problems they had on both the electricity and the gas side. But very different in a way from a more competitive markets, where you have more options to mitigate that risk. Now, Europe. So we are running power market models for the European power markets, and we published a forecast for the year 2020-2021 with regard to the impact of COVID on the power markets, and particularly power prices and so forth. And by then we analyzed both a V shape and a U recovery, which is more slow. And so you can actually read the assumptions we did by then in that report. And overall, we got it quite right on the electricity demand side. But I will talk a bit about what happened on the power price side of this. So in that report, we summarized it as follows. We saw that electricity demand would be lower in Europe, and in the range of -4%, -6% levels, as also I think already indicated by Julia. That's quite well in line with what we see as a turnout of the markets. But we were much lower with regard to our forecast on the power prices, and so now we'll talk a bit about that. and you know what the key issues there were. But the key takeaway was that the first wave Corona crisis in Europe coincided with a record low gas prices. You know, we were at 4.9 euro per megawatt hour in May 2020, which is extremely low for gas, as well as a very high snowpacks in the Nordics, so an oversupply situation in the Nordic markets. And of course that somehow made Corona impact less visible because we already had these very low, you know, these two aspects which are typically driving power prices down, right? So now the upper chart that's based on N3. These are the changes in loads in 2020 compared to 2019. So I think that Julio, you already covered that, and indeed we are seeing that electricity demand in Europe is recovering already in Q3 and Q4. So so that is we have discussed that. Now on the Europe gas and CO2 prices. So on the left top chart, those are the gas prices, the TTF gas prices, which are you know, an important benchmark for gas prices in Europe. And they run from 2008 to 2021, just to get a feel for how volatile they are anyway, right? And so in March, and that's just right from that red line, the gas prices hit that bottom low and then climbed up back to about 20 euro per megawatt hour, which is not what the market was foreseeing at that time, given the forwards in the market. CO2, another important price driver that's on the bottom of this slide, actually also bounced back after initial dropping to around 20 euro per megawatt to 20 euro per ton. Now we're now at around 38, and actually highest levels seen in the EU ETS market. So these are two very strong price drivers driving power prices up. CO2 is really under upward pressure because there's expectation that the European Commission will tighten the EU ETS caps, and you know, because of even more focus on reducing greenhouse gases in Europe. That resulted in the following development of power prices in Europe. So you see on the top left there are power prices for a couple of markets. The red one is Germany, and you see that you know, prices moved from you know, well, the 35 euro per megawatt hour level in January down to around 20, but then now we are back up in the 40 euro per megawatt hour range, and these are the spot prices. So that's of course significant volatility, but definitely you know, that price trend is really you know, driven by gas and CO2 prices, which is the chart on the left bottom. Red, that's again Germany, and yeah, you see that gas is climbing up. That's the blue line, and of course it has an upward pressure on power prices, and the same for CO2. As said, we are now a bit above 30. So that's a surprise, not expected by the market. And so what I'm showing here is how actually the market was looking forward to, and in this case, the year 2022 and the year 2023. So these are the forward contracts for the calendar year 2022 and 23 traded in Germany. And you see that you know, around the first wave, which is that red line, the forwards, they hit a low and then climbed up again, and they are now trading at highest levels, back to, let's say, 2019 you know, levels. So and that's quite yeah, different as was expected. But you see also that the traded markets also had different views back in March. So yeah, the first wave Corona crisis definitely coincided with record low gas prices and moderate CO2 prices. And now, of course, we are seeing that because of the higher gas CO2 prices, power prices are back up in the range of the 2019 level. So longer term forecasting. So we are running an energy transition outlook model. That's a global model where we every year we look at the global energy demand and the production to fulfill energy demand until 2050. So you might know in our ETO, and you can go to our website to have a look at the reports. And so what we have seen is that there is a structural long-lasting impact of COVID on energy demand going forward. It's about 8%, mostly driven by lower GDP expectations in the long run, but also some structural changes like shifts in transport, but also, for instance, a lower amount of new offices being built, which have an impact on the iron and steel industry. So it's a mix. It looks like that's a nice constant bandwidth, right, from 2020 to 2050, but there's a few things going on which ultimately lead to this kind of almost constant 8% of reduction of energy demand. So the report, of course, shows also what the sectoral impact is, and the contribution to energy demand, and by fuel, of course, electricity, as we see it, it's going to be the most important energy carrier by 2050, under pressure of or driven by the lower cost of renewable energy. But most importantly, although COVID also has an impact on greenhouse gas emissions, this is still not high enough to offset or to meet the Paris targets. So it has limited long-term impact on the climate. So with that, I'd like to summarize that the market responded very fast in March. Of course, many started to come out with forecasts. The traded markets responded, but you see that there can be other fundamentals, like for instance gas and CO2 prices, which might actually be even more relevant at the moment for the outlook on the power markets going forward.
Okay, thank you. Thanks a lot, Mr. Stoffer. We have already a lot of questions coming from the floor. The first question is, I think, for both Julia and Bart. What is the reason behind the increase of renewable market share during the lockdown? Is this because there is a priority of injection of renewable energy? What is your what will be your explanation?
Yes, I think one of the reasons is indeed that in several electricity markets, the renewables have a prioritization over other shares of energy. But we also saw that the fact that there was less demand led some power plants to be to basically scroll down. And we had also a very favorable climate in several regions that favored solar and wind production, as well as hydro. Yeah.
Okay. Bart, if you...
Yeah, no, we are seeing the same. And of course, we are very active in the renewable energy business and also with investors. And effectively, through last year, the focus on renewable energy maintained, and definitely also with policymakers probably even they came out even stronger. Of course, you also have the package which came out from the Commission, and you see a continued focus on driving greenhouse gas reductions and deployment of renewable energy globally. And we also, of course, saw, like also what Julia was showing, that coal-fired generation, particularly in Europe, had a hard time because of the lower gas prices. Right? So ultimately, there was a strong drive of capital towards strong wind projects, offshore wind projects. We see interest in hydrogen and of course solar. So it's a very strong market.
Okay, then we have a technical question for Bart. Can you re-explain shortly the difference between the U and V shape in terms of energy consumption on the rational below this two shape of curve? And then we'll have a question about the future.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question actually. So the V shape typically is there's an economic term in terms of how fast an economy would respond to a crisis, and so the V shape would mean that the economy would bounce back very fast. A U shape typically is a bit slower, and so in March we looked at those two differences in terms of economic response to the COVID crisis. Arguably, we might have seen a W shape, right? Because we are having a few waves, and so I think we just decided to take two cases in order to show what the differences are, right? And that you get a feel for the delta, not necessarily trying to really forecast if that U shape, for instance, would become or could become a W shape, and arguably, so that's the difference. V is fast and U is a bit slower.
And then there has been a lot of questions from the floor about the future. Basically, there is some question about how can you forecast a rebound in the consumption when the crisis is still here? So this is a pessimistic view. And the other question from Mohamed Lamin from Algeria is, if you look at the Spanish flu, there has been a huge decrease and then a huge rebound. And then if you make the integral of the consumption, it has been a flat consumption if you take away the shock. So what would be, sorry, I'm asking to look in the crystal box or in the crystal ball, but what would be your best guess? Is this a sharp and long-term decline? Is this only a temporary shock, or does the COVID-19 crisis will have to say it was only a small crisis, and the past it will be swept in the past very fast? Julia, your best guess for the future?
Oh, that's a very difficult question.
It's a tricky
maybe
question,
just to start,
especially for data analysis.
Yes, exactly. Maybe just to start, why we expect electricity demand to 2021 to rebound. I've shown it a little bit in China, for example. We already see a rebound, already very strong in the last months of 2020, and that's how this, and the fact that government response has been less strict in the last months, is actually how we can say, okay, we expect electricity demand to rebound. Then on the question of the near future, I have to say I'm looking more at the real-time data, so I will have to pass the questions to Bart.
But Bart already answered by stating that for the future there is a good news for greenhouse gases emission, but the bad news for the global economy.
Yeah.
Yes,
well,
that's true.
Yeah. And if I may, sorry, Julia, but we are more experts on energy than economy. So we have been taking for our energy transition outlook, we have been taking the IMF longer outbreak scenario as a basis, and that already forecasts quite a drop in GDP in 2050 versus the base case, let's say, and so there is so we take into account that volume impact, but in most structural, the largest structural impacts can be seen in transport, and as said, in some industries which are dependent on things like steel. I think that's what Julia also talked about. The impact the COVID has on the oil industry is really interesting, and I think that's much more significant in a way than the electricity sector. So of course, what that means is that we see an increasing interest of the oil and gas majors to enter the power sector, and that can be. I think that was already clearly visible, but probably the COVID crisis is amplifying that a bit.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are now. It's now time to give the floor to David Robertson now. So as David Robertson, you have heard what are the forecast for next years and the years ongoing. And so as you see, there is a lot of uncertainty. And Mr. Robertson will make a presentation about the price formation in the long term and how does investor act in an uncertain world. This is a really tricky question. So Mr. Robertson, he is an analyst, and he has worked since a long time also in the energy sector, and he has been working also for European TSO, transport and transport operators. And his main task is to make us understand what will be the future market of the energy sector with a crisis so unforeseen and unforgettable also as the COVID-19 crisis. So Mr. Robertson, floor is yours for 10 to 12 minutes, and then I think we will have a lot of questions arising from your presentation. Mr. Robertson.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I really wanted to follow on from Bart's discussion and maybe dive a little deeper into some of these topics. So just by way of background, so Energy Exemplar, the organization that I am a part of, is as a brand maybe is not quite as well known as the likes of DNVGL within the industry. From a brand perspective, we are more commonly known as the developers of the Plexos software. So we are not a consulting organization. We don't have necessarily a forward view on what the future holds, but we do work with a large number of utilities and transmission operators, consultants, and regulators and research bodies around the world, around about 400 of these organizations, using our Plexos energy market simulation software to be able to really drill into the fundamentals of energy markets and make decisions that impact the short term, the medium term, and the long term. So what I wanted to do today is to maybe take a little bit of a focus around the GB market, and first of all try to understand a little bit more about what happened within GB as one of the markets that's been hit quite badly throughout the course of the COVID pandemic. And then turn the attention to what are the questions that our customers are using fundamental models to answer across various different timeframes. So with that, let me just take a look into to what's happening within GB. So what I really wanted to do is I was taking a look at you know, the year-on-year 2019 to 2020 as the previous presenters have also considered. And within GB, what I did is I really focused down into what happened at the different stages of restrictions that were placed on the country and the impacts on both the energy demand and the consumption patterns, and then how did that impact things like prices within the market. So as you can see, if we start at the beginning of the year, so this top graph that we're looking at here is the situation as of January 1st right through to March the 23rd, when the UK first went into a national lockdown. So you can see that from an overall consumption standpoint, 2019, which is shown in green, was largely the same as 2020. There was a small change in demand, a 2.5% reduction, but largely very much consistent with the expectation. And then at the bottom of the screen here, we also have the average load shapes, both for a weekend and a weekday period. Again, reasonably consistent with what we would have expected to see based upon what happened in 2019. So if we then go to what happened on March the 23rd, so the UK entered a period of national lockdown from the 23rd of March, and those restrictions were largely in place until the 10th of May. And this period we saw, first of all, a significant decrease in total consumption. So as we've seen in many of the other geographies that we've been looking at this morning, over that period we had a 13.5% drop in consumption. But what's really interesting is when we start to look at some of the actual shapes of what was happening with the demand. So it looks like we tend to sort of drop the consumption, but we're following at a similar trajectory for the daily shape as you look at the overall consumption pattern. But if you start to analyze this in more detail, what you see is that in the mornings, if we look at 2020, the gradient, the slope of the demand increase over this period from around 7 a.m. through till around 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. is a lot less steep than it was in the case of 2020. So what's happening here is that from a residential perspective, as everybody is waking up on a morning and they're switching on their toasters and their kettles, you tend to see that there is under normal circumstances, there's a sharp increase as everybody gets up and they start to prepare for that commute into the workforce. So while you have while you do have a drop in the overall energy consumption, really one of the biggest impacts here is around that slope and the requirements from the market. To be able to meet that demand requires a lot less flexibility in the types of assets which are actually being operated. And then we see a similar phenomenon in the afternoon. So in the afternoon, we get actually a sharp rise. So we see the inverse of what we had in that afternoon peak, as more people are working from home and there is a lot more flexibility in how they organize their day. And so you start to see people taking mid-afternoon breaks, and that shape starts to steepen up here. So again, in that afternoon period, we're starting to see a real need for more flexible assets in this case coming online. So we have this phenomenon where actually we're flattening out the curve in the morning, requiring less flexibility, but then increasing the slope in the afternoon period, requiring even more flexibility. So if we move through the year and just take a quick look at what actually happened. So as we move into the period after May the 10th, where there was an easing of restrictions on the C&I side of things, so there were a number of businesses that were able to reopen on the commercial and industrial side of things. We start to see a slight increase in the consumption, but what's more important is we actually start to see those shapes starting to regain some more normality as more of the workforce is returning to work. And then in the summer, around about the 4th of July, there was an announcement that a number of the restrictions are being lifted, and in true UK fashion, the most important of those restrictions is that the pubs reopened. And this is my favorite piece of the puzzle, because as the pubs reopened, as we expect, the world more or less returns to normal. So when we have reopening of society, the demand bounces back, so we go to a 4.5% reduction. And remembering that even before the lockdown, we had 2.5% year-on-year drop in overall demand. So we're very much getting back on track to where we expect to be. By the 5th of November, there was a second national lockdown. So if we look at the second national lockdown, what's interesting is that while the restrictions were largely similar to what we had in the first round, the drop in overall demand was nowhere near as significant as the first national lockdown, and this is largely due to people becoming a little bit apathetic and not taking those restrictions quite as heavily. So those people who were maybe not going out to work in the first lockdown are being a little bit more laxed with some of the rules as you come into some of these later periods. And then finally, we move into this period at the very end of the year in December, where we move to a more regional model for lockdown. And you can see that actually by this period, even with those regional restrictions in place, we're basically completely back to where we would expect to be based upon the 2019 demand profile. So if we move and we take a look at how this impacts power prices. So firstly, if we look at what's happening during the first national lockdown, so that period of the first national lockdown, huge drop in prices in the GB market, so around 40% drop year on year from what we saw in 2019. But the shape largely remains the same across this period. And as you start to expect, as you go through and you start to ease the restrictions, the power prices, there's a small bounce back, 37% drop year on year in that period, May through July. And then again, as you get into the summer months, the prices tend to rebound at this point. And so let me move on in the interest of time and not spend too long on any one area. As we if we take a look at what's actually driving the power prices, I mean, essentially we've talked about the renewables and the increase in renewables. So if we were to look at, for example, wind, in the first period of the year before we even had the lockdown, if we were to look at the overall wind in the system, just move my panel around a little bit. If we look at the overall wind in the system, we can see that actually there was a huge amount of additional wind within GB, even in the first part of the year. So that even before the lockdown occurred, you actually had a big drop in the residual demand, which is basically the total demand minus the any non-dispatchable load like your renewables. And so as we come into the lockdown, even though the wind seems to rebound, we get this huge increase drop in the residual demand, and this is essentially what is going to set the pricing during that period. So I make this introduction to say that actually a lot of what we've been talking about is the impact of the demand destruction and how that potentially impacts the market. What was interesting is what we did was we took the in our Plexos software, we actually did an analysis of what would happen if we took 2019 and we only reduced the overall demand. So our starting point was we took 2019 data and we ran a fundamental model within Plexos of what happened in 2019 as a starting point, really just to benchmark what was going on in the market in that period. And so as we, our starting point was really just to make sure that our software was providing the correct response to the market conditions. So you can see as we drill down in 2019, this is the green was what actually happened in 2019, the blue was what we simulated in 2019. So we have reasonable confidence that the software is actually providing the correct response to the market. So if we were to take a look at that period of the first lockdown from 23rd of March through to the 10th of May in 2019, and then we replace that demand consumption with what we saw happening in 2020, well, actually what we see is that there's not significant impact on the power prices. So the demand destruction that we're seeing as a result of COVID by itself is not enough to actually drive down the prices that we saw in 2020. So just to remind you, this is what we were actually looking at, the difference in 2020. So again, at this point, really what we need to do is we need to look at what's happening in the rest of the sector in order to better understand that. So again, I'm not going to go through in detail what was happening because Bart's already shown the significant drop that we had in prices for gas and for carbon over that period. So what I will do is I'll maybe just switch out and talk a little bit about some of the things that our customers are looking at and using our fundamental models for in order to better understand the result of COVID. And so here, just to summarize, because I'm aware that we're running short on time.
David, we are a little bit out of time, so if you can do it in 1 minute, this is a challenge.
Yep. So basically, what we're doing is we're constructing a set of scenarios for what a COVID future looks like based upon in the short term looking at demand reduction and the drop in prices, but then also considering impacts of maintenance referral, long time recovery associated with stimulus for a green recovery. And our customers are answering what the impact is in the short, medium, and long term. So in the short term, on the market side, looking at what happens with the demand reduction, but also considering the fact that most of the utilities were majority hedged through 2020, but that is going to change in 2021. So looking at how they re-hedge their positions. In the medium term, looking at the impact of those deferred investment decisions and the impact of what maintenance deferrals has on the operation of assets and reduced running hours in things like coal assets. And then finally, in that long term, also considering what's the impact of reduction in government spending and therefore being able to perhaps not be able to invest in things like CFDs and capacity auctions.
Okay, David, thank you very much for the presentation. This is a real, very interesting model, and you are enthusiastic with the presentation of this model. So it's a little bit hard to maintain the time frame. There's two technical questions, and the first one is there is difference between weekday and weekend. And can you explain a little bit more about the main difference in the modeling of in the modeling of the offer, demand, and the price formation? And there is another question arising from the floor. It's clear that 2020 has been exceptional compared to 2019. But what if we do the comparison with other years? Is this so exceptional? Is there really COVID-19 effect? Do we have a comparison with an average of year, for example, 2010 being up to 2018?
Sure. Okay, so I guess the first question in terms of looking at the difference between the weekday and the weekend consumption. So from a modelling perspective, of course, the main driver of the differences between the weekday and the weekend is the demand profiles, and that's largely due to C&I customers, which are driving higher demand during the weekdays versus the weekends being primarily only the residential demand with some smaller component of C&I. So that's something which we take into consideration within our models. We break down the demand into the different components which can be input into the model in order to understand what the driver is behind each of those different periods. In terms of the actual the impact that we're seeing on the market side of things, Again, I think that there is a tendency to look at what's happening within the markets and say that, you know, this is really coinciding with what's happening with COVID, and therefore it's a direct result of COVID. I think that that's true to a certain extent. We have, as has been mentioned previously, we have been hit by, for example, a quite large share of renewable generation in the mix this year due to things like large snowpack in certain regions and large wind generation, like we saw in some of the presentation, and that's really driving that residual demand down that we looked at. So I think even without a COVID scenario, we might have seen impacts there on the pricing. There's also been within, for example, in the GB market, we've also reduced nuclear output as well, and that's really independent of COVID. But I think what's really profound here is actually it's that sector coupling influence, and it's looking at what's happening actually in the gas markets, and it's really the gas price which is being driven down that's really impacting what we're seeing on the power markets, as opposed to purely the demand destruction from an electricity perspective.
Okay, so what I just have in mind due to following your presentation is that the drop in the demand is not so high, but the drop in the price has been huge, and it's not totally explained by market modeling, to say it shortly. Did I make a good resume?
It is. Well, it's explained by market modeling, but it's not explained purely by demand profiles, which I think is a misconception that we have within the industry, that a lot of the impact of what we're seeing in the market is a direct result of demand destruction.
Thank you very much, David. This was very rich and very interesting. So now we have the presentation. We will have the presentation of Mr. ODYAKMAZ. Mr. ODYAKMAZ is since 20 years in the energy sector, not only at Sedas but also in GUYON and other company, and he will give you a deep insight view of what happened in a company dealing with electricity during the COVID-19. And I wanted to say in introduction, this is a very, very fascinating presentation, because from the little fact of everyday business in the energy sector, then you have question arising about what is our way of life before and after COVID-19. What will be the management? What will be the way of working? And what is the impact of digitalization on the energy sector, which is also another revolution that had been put in the front of the scene due to the COVID-19 crisis. So, Mr. ODYAKMAZ, the floor is yours. You have 10 to 15 minutes to present. Your presentation is very rich, so do not hesitate to be a little bit fast, and then we will have spare time for question. Thank you very much, Mr. ODYAKMAZ. It's your turn.
Merci beaucoup, Yvon. And I would like to say hello to every participants and the contributors from myself and on behalf of my company. I will try to be very quick in terms of the presentation. I would like to also develop a wider perspective in terms of the COVID and in terms of the operation. Unfortunately, we found ourselves in the middle of the crisis when the COVID pandemic came into the picture on the March 19, 2019. And I would like to a little bit talk about the Sedas. We are a distribution company owned 50% by FAUCHEUX, one of the biggest Turkish conglomerates in different industrial area, and also the biggest utility of the Czechia, ČEZ. And we are serving more than 2 million customers, which almost corresponds to 18 to 20 million inhabitants within the region, distribution region. And also we are distributing more than 10 million megawatt hour electricity per annum. I would like to ask the help of the ERRA to move the slides. Next one, please.
Okay.
This is the content of the presentation, but as I've said before, I will try to be very quick. Next one, please. Okay. If you're some sort of consultant, or maybe the regulator, or maybe the observer of the events, so you are observing one side, and after that you are making, or you are trying to make the right decision in terms of what's happening. But on the other hand, if you are running a distribution company, then you are finding yourself in the middle of something. So in terms of the phase, and as a response, or as a response to the questions of the previous questions, how quick you are reacting when you are in these phases of the crisis, it's also shaping the shape of the recovery curve. It's going to be either U-shape or the V-shape, or sometimes W-shape from the learning by doing. At the first tier is the shock and response. You are feeling something is a shock, and then you are making some response instinctively or planned way. And after that, you are accepting the situation and try to recover it. And after that, you try to survive and you renew the situation by looking into yourself, by reorganization, by making some changes. But at the end of the day, as a humanity, as a company, as some institution, you have to learn how to live with this crisis, how to live with the new world or the new era. Next one, please. So as a COVID, we always consider the COVID as a tool, as an exogenous shock as well. The first one, you can use the COVID as a mask to cover some your failures or mistakes, or COVID you can use as a litmus paper to observe what kind of let's say what kind of problem you have in your company, or what kind of fragilities in your company as well. Or you can use the COVID-19 as a catalyst, or as a catalyzer, or as an accelerator for your movement. If you choose the third one, and then you can get the benefit of the COVID-19 rather than the crisis. Next one, please. So in terms of general, when you look at the general consumption, electricity consumption, or the operations, the field operations, you have to deal with the electricity consumption, which decreased. So I will come to the later. And after that, field operations, you have to deliver as a distribution company within the responsibilities of your general framework, which is coming from the regulator. And also you have to survive as a company. So you have to collect, you have to get the cash in order to survive. So I will come how we dealt with this problem during the crisis time. Next one, please. So I'm not going to into the very details, but in terms of the operation, yes, of course, we had some limitation, sometimes which is coming from directly, which came from directly to the field, or some of them came directly from the regulator as a measures to the COVID crisis. And on the other hand, how we reacted from the employee and the stakeholder point of view. We employed the employee support program AVITA in order to support our employees both from the psychological point of view and also physical point of view. Also, we developed the flexible working scheme, and also we used this as an accelerator to go to full digitalization of the company. And after that, we organized new way of working in the field activities as well. And when you come to the digitalization side, we increased our digitalization ratio within the company in order to limit, or in order to minimize our customers' face-to-face relations, face-to-face interactions. Next one, please. So the first shock from our company point of view, we almost spent 3 million Turkish lira for the measures. So you may say that some of the climate system in terms of the air conditioning, also masks and also gloves, also disinfectants for the hands. We spent some of the money. This money corresponds mostly 250,000 euro per annum. And also there are some other things. So as I've said before, we try to use this COVID in order to increase our performance for the field activities. Next one, please. when you look at as the general distributed energy, which more or less correspond to the demand, and you see with the blue ones, there is a drastic decrease in the demand during the April, May. It starts on the March, but mostly April, May, and June 2019. And after that, we can observe, or we observed some kind of rebound, and we ended the year slightly, a little bit increase in the demand. It can be surprising in terms of the increase, the positive increase or the positive difference. But when you compare this with the previous years, let's say performance of the demand or the demand increase, it can be quite low increase, because there's a positive relations or correlation between the Turkish economic growth, the GDP, and also the electricity consumption in the Turkey, which corresponds that the 4 to 5% annual increase in the electricity demand is a normal increase or natural rate of increase in terms of electricity consumption in Turkey, which means that 1% is quite low. Next one, please. So we have different activities. One of them is the meter reading. For example, we face the challenges with this one. At one hand, all of the customers, they don't want to interact with you, but on the other hand, all of the roads sometimes are empty, which make it easier for you or for your employees to read the meters by walking. So we increase our meter reading ratio below the 90% to 94.6% per annum. Next one, please. So, to sum up, there is 3 things I would like to say as a conclusion. One thing is that the best thing you have to do during the crisis, try to get the pulse of your employees and the customers. Try to make interviews and try to make some poll outs with your customers and the employees, how they are perceiving the crisis, how they are perceiving also the way you are managing the crisis. In order to get their contribution and their support is very important. How is the level of the perception? The second is that how you are dealing with the crisis, how you are using the crisis. The first thing is that you may use it, as I've said before, as an accelerator. So as a company, as a distribution company, we use it to increase our performance by flexible working hours and the flexible working system. And second is that we used it to increase or to make it speeder or digitalization ratio. That's why we hope that we manage to keep up an eye on our customers, and we keep to protect our employees from the epidemic. And on the other hand, we managed to increase our performance in terms of the field activities. I would like to thank you. This is the end of my presentation. If you have any questions from the participants, I will be more than happy to answer them.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. ODYAKMAZ. It was very rich. I have already 2 questions. The first question is about the management. How did the management react to this, to the fact that there is a need from customer, from employees to be supported? And the second question is, in your view, did the COVID-19 had an impact on how the regulator and how the regulated bodies, because you are in a regulated body, see their job? And I will add another question. If the digitalization is going deeper and deeper in the process of the company, is there a separation between the management of the infrastructure on one side and the management of the market to recover bills, to establish a relationship with customers? This is 2 separate and 2 different jobs in company. So how do you manage to keep them together, especially when there is a COVID-19 crisis?
Okay, it's a very deep question. I think the answer to your first question is that in terms of the customer relations, how can I say, the magic word is the empathy. So you have to put yourself in the shoes of the customers, and consider yourself how you would react to this kind of a COVID crisis. So you may be in the economic difficulties. You don't want to come to the customer relation centers. You would like to handle your things, your paying the invoices or your observation, your consumptions via digital channels. But sometimes you cannot use this computer, you cannot get used to this kind of a technology. So we thought about this one, and we said that, okay, we need to take some of the measures in our customer relations centers at one hand, and on the other hand, we have to react, or we have to reach to our customers via different channels. For example, we also set a WhatsApp channel with our customers. So we said to them that we don't want to, or we would like to be face-to-face with you with a physical interaction, but you know that there's a COVID. So if you have difficulties, you may directly call us, and also you may use our WhatsApp channel, or you may use our call center for different kind of questions. So we, at the one hand, we try to differentiate our channels which are reaching to the customers, and we try to increase their capacities as well in terms of getting their complaints, getting their requests. But I'm repeating again, the magical word in here is the empathy. You have to feel how your customers, how your employees feel against this kind of a COVID crisis, because it's a pandemic crisis, not an economic one. And when you look at it from regulatory perspective, they have to, at first hand, they have to accept that it's a new thing, but it will leave some permanent effects both in the market and the regulatory environment. Yes, you may have some short-term and immediate measures against this kind of a crisis is acceptable, but at the end of the day, for the mid-term, you have to consider some permanent changes within the regulatory system and within the management of this kind of regulated jobs. And most of the important ones is going to be, as it has been said by the other contributors, the rising star of the renewables, the green energy, and also digitalization for the utility side of the network.
Okay.
I'm not sure that this is a satisfactory answer or not.
And I got also another question about this crisis and the impact of the crisis. Do you think that the energy sector, this is a pandemic crisis, so this is a sanitary crisis. So the energy sector, this is not my business. It's a job from other people to solve the problem of the crisis. And what we saw in your presentation is that at the end of the road, energy is a primary good for a lot of people and consumer and enterprises and so on. So do you feel that the energy sector will have to play a specific role and to pay a specific cost in the resolution of the COVID-19 crisis in the long term? Or is the energy sector just a spectator of what's arriving, of what's arising in our society due to COVID-19 crisis? My feeling is that you think that energy is not so such a common good as people are used to think.
Yes, you are right. I like to say that I'm sharing your idea. But when you look at only the energy sector, I mean, during this time, it's when the people are stayed or are still staying at their homes, and also the generations or the production side, let's say industrial production, decreased and are in the stable now. Everyone understood that the electricity is vital. It's a vital good, and it's a sine qua non for everyone. You cannot live without electricity, it's for sure. That's why everyone is now accepting that if there would be a price for the sake of the, let's say, to get rid of the pandemic or to keep up the comfort level in the daily life, we have to pay what is necessary. So that's why I'm always thinking that it will create this kind of a crisis. Maybe it's my personal idea, will create positive effect, positive success, and some permanent positive gains in the energy sector. and it will help for the evolution.
Yeah.
It will help for the acceleration of the digitalization. It will help for the reduce of the carbon dioxide ratios. It will help for the rising star position of the renewables, even electrical cars, e-vehicles, different type of interaction between the utilities companies and the customers as well.
Okay, thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. And there was a human side in your presentation that I wouldn't say that there was no human side in the previous presentation, but it was very economic with datas. And thanks to your presentation, we go back to the fact that there are humans in the energy sectors, and the customer of the energy sector are also humans. So there's been some questions that I am just keeping for the last session of the panel. So if there are some people frustrated on the floor, thinking that I have not been taking that question, no, I'm just keeping them for the last session. This is overall question like how does the COVID-19 crisis ask the regulator to act differently? We are now just in time for the technical break. So if somebody wants to take coffee, do not hesitate. It's coffee break, it's coffee time. And I wanted also to thank once again the people and all the brilliant panelists from this morning. But you will see them in the last session for, I would say, more structural question. And do not hesitate during the break, if you have one of the structural questions going to mind, to put it in the chat. Technical break, 10 minutes, and we see at, just let me look, what up, sorry, at 11:40 for a presentation about what's going in Africa, what's going in developing countries. We have a joint presentation of Mr. ROUGUET and Mr. not Obega, sorry, there has been a Mr. MWONDHA, sorry. See you in 10 minutes, good coffee, and be back at 11:40. Thank you very much.
Thank you. A bientôt.
FAUCHEUX, you're muted.
Yes. We still can't hear you. Please unmute yourself. Try it again. Nothing yet.
Sorry, everybody. Welcome back to everybody. I'm sorry. I had this is the kind of problem that sometimes with the webinar. Okay, so welcome back to the webinar about the impact of the COVID-19 on the energy sector, and we will start with two presentations about the impact of the COVID-19 in the African sector. So the first presentation will be made by Arnaud ROUGUET, if I don't make a mistake. Arnaud ROUGUET is working as an energy expert at the Africa and Energy Access at the EIA, International Energy Agency, and he has a strong experience in the off-grid and on-grid development in the energy field. And then we will have a presentation from Mr. Micheal MWONDHA, and he's a senior economist at the Electricity Regulatory Authority of Uganda, and he will give us a presentation about the impact of the COVID-19 on the African continent. So perhaps Mr. ROUGUET, the floor is yours. So if you can give us an insight, because we have been speaking a lot about Europe, Asia, and America. So now it's time to see what had been the impact on the African continent. Floor is yours, and thank you very much for today's presentation. Mr. ROUGUET, I think your microphone is mute.
Sorry.
So
thank you very much, Yvan. Just before I start, can you confirm you can see my screen?
Yeah, it's okay.
Perfect. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I think you already received one of my colleagues this morning who presented global numbers on how the COVID-19 impacted the energy systems in 2020. So I will focus my my presentation more on Africa. But maybe, again, before going to Africa, just setting the scene here, let's look maybe fuel by fuel at how the energy demand was impacted last year. So on this chart, you would see energy demand change between 2020 compared to the previous year. And as you can see, oil and coal were the most affected fuels. The average number is that in 2020, global energy demand decreased by 5%, which is the largest shock to the energy system we have witnessed since 70 years. But there are many variations across fuels, as you can see on this chart, with modern renewables being more resilient. And as a consequence, having coal decreasing more than renewables, the energy-related CO2 emissions have decreased more than energy demand, so they have decreased by 7%. And just before coming back to Africa and entering again into 2020, I just want to give a bit of outlook, because this is what we are doing a lot at the IEA, making projections, building scenario. So just taking 1 minute to discuss that, what could happen in the future. So here you can see how primary energy demand could evolve by 2030 in our stated policy scenario, where we assume that the pandemic will be brought under control by 2021. So there are GDP and economy recovery assumption behind it. And what you can see is that oil comes back to its growth level of the pre-crisis trajectory, but there is no such rebound for coal. Then you can see that gas is also, the outlook for gas is also impressive, but the big winner are renewables, especially in the power sector, because we expect renewables to be able to meet 50% of the growth in energy demand. So this is one scenario with the underlying policy which are taken by countries to the extent they are backed by serious programs. But what if these assumptions are too optimistic And we have built another scenario, which is a delayed recovery scenario, in which the pandemic effects last longer and it has more scars on the economy, on the social life, and this will lead to a weaker economic outlook. And as you can see, in this case, by 2030, the growth for oil will be almost totally wiped out. Coal prospect is even worse, but modern renewables are again very resilient. In case you think this is a good news under this scenario, especially under climate and the CO2 emissions perspective, because indeed we have less coal, we have more renewables, so energy emissions would be way lower. This is just the picture for energy demand, but it's not good news because those emissions reductions are taken for the bad reasons, and also this delayed economic recovery has many negative impacts. And coming to Africa, I'll stress on two impacts we've observed last year in 2020. The first one is on population without access to electricity, and the second one is on investment. So going to population without electricity in Africa, as EIA has been tracking country by country since 2000, how this number has evolved, and we observed that from 2013, there was actually progress, and the progress in giving access to electricity were outpacing population growth for the first time. So we had many countries very dynamic, Kenya, Ghana, Ethiopia, just to mention a few. But in 2019, due to the pandemic, we think that we observed that the number of people without electricity access is rising back. And on the right part of the chart, you can see that almost 600 million people in Africa are lacking electricity, and half of them are concentrated in only five countries. And this issue of access to electricity is increasing and is increasingly an African issue, with India having reached universal access in the last years, and with Southeast Asia also making impressive progress. So what are the reasons for this drawback in expanding electricity access? First, in 2020, government had to shift priorities to manage the crisis. So we have seen, for example, in South Africa, subsidies to rural electrification projects that have been put on hold to put them into health measures. But it's not only about the public sector. When we look at the private sector, for example, operators who are deploying mini grids or companies distributing solar home system, they have also been impacted by the crisis. In some countries with lockdown, it was complex to continue the distribution activities of solar home systems. The international supply chain have been disrupted with communication with China, and imports, especially for landlocked country, being more complex. So as a result, according to the Solar Home System and Pico Solar Product Association, there has been a 10% drop in sales of such products in 2020 compared to the previous year. So it's for government, but it's also for private sector. And what is very concerning is that in addition to this this rise of people without electricity access, our analysis also show that many people that had access to electricity are at risk of not affording this electricity. We estimate there are 30 million people in Africa that could lose access due to inability to afford the services. And we observe the same trend in cooking, with people who today are using clean fuels like LPG, but which are at risk of backsliding to more traditional fuels and using back more charcoal and fuel wood. How is the future? We think, according to our analysis, that by 2030, so by the time we are supposed to reach the universal access to electricity, there would still be 630 million people without access to electricity, under our scenario with a delayed economic recovery, and there would be more than 1 billion people still lacking access to clean cooking. Maybe looking at investment now. In 2020, globally, there has been a huge drop in investment in the energy sector, minus 18%, which is more than 300 billion. And but this has not been the same across all fuels. And this statement is even exacerbated in Africa, because in Africa, the drop in energy investment has been much higher. It's been a drop by 1/3 or 30 billion USD. And we can see that oil and gas upstream took the bulk of this decrease. They make 3/4 of this decrease, but also investment in grids have decreased. But on the contrary, investment in renewable have increased. This is true at a global level, but this is exacerbated in Africa because there is a plus 50% in investment in Africa in 2020 compared to the previous year. Still, Africa attracts a very small share of the investment in the renewable share. In the renewable space, less than 5%. And one of the reasons for that is the cost of capital. As we know, cost of funds in Africa is already very high, but we have seen that it has increased last year by an average 1/3, so exceeding 7%. Whereas at the same time, in other regions of the world, like the US, like EU, cost of borrowing has decreased. So there is a need to ensure that cost of capital remain affordable in Africa, because to take one concrete example, for solar PV, we have been observing some very impressive decline in cost of the technology, but this decline in cost are offset by the increase in cost of capital. Moving very briefly and concluding on the power sector, more specifically, electricity demand is to rise everywhere in the world, doubling in China, but also doubling in Africa. And we think there will be strong changes in the way we generate electricity. The reign of coal is over, and now solar PV is becoming the new king. Solar PV being the cheapest source to produce electricity in most countries in the world. In the case of Africa, we anticipate under current policies an increase of 20% of solar PV generation per year. And this makes a lot of sense because Africa is home to 40% of the solar resource in the world. But in Africa today, there is only 6 gigawatts of solar PV, which is the same as what you would find in the UK or Netherlands. As we all know, Africa is much sunnier than the UK and much bigger. So there is no reason why installed capacity of solar PV cannot rise. And there is also good news for reaching access to universal access to electricity. We've conducted a lot of geospatial analysis to try to see what is the least cost pathway to bring electricity to everyone. And in many cases, it's about extending and densifying the grid, but there is also an important role for mini grids and for standalone systems. I'm stopping here and happy to take questions as they come. Thank you.
Okay, Arnaud, thank you very much for the presentation, which was, to say, a little bit pessimistic and a little bit optimistic. Solar will be the new king of Africa, and it's good news for people who are off grid. This is the main message I just had, but also there is a significant drop in the investment, and it has a social and overall impact which are not so optimistic. So I will leave the floor now to Micheal MWONDHA. And Micheal MWONDHA, who is, as I told you, is a senior economist in Uganda, and he has 11 years of experience in competition and monitoring of the electricity supply. And he will make a presentation from the Energy Regulator Association of East Africa. How did the regulator react to the COVID-19 crisis, especially in the electricity sector? Micheal, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ivan, and thank you all for organizing this webinar. And I'll straight dive into the presentation, building on to what Arnaud has just presented. I hope I'm able to be heard by everyone. You help me move through the slides. So we can move to the next slide. And what I want to begin off with is that the East African region, I'll majorly focus on the East African region, and we have what we call the Energy Regulators Association of East Africa that brings together a number of utility regulators within the East African region. So both water, electricity, gas regulators have this association that brings together. And the main objective of this association is to promote regional cooperation in terms of infrastructure planning, but also capacity building and development of sustainable regulatory frameworks across the region of East Africa. If we could move to the next slide. So what COVID has shown us so far is that it is reversing some of the gains that we had gotten over the years in terms of targets to access to electricity, but also growth in demand, and also attracting investments into the East African region and the African region. So one of the things that happened is that we have provisions within a number of agreements, including the implementation agreements, the power purchase agreements, and also the licenses that are issued to the different operators within the sector. So one of the provisions within these agreements are the force majeure provisions, and some of these operators decided to call upon these provisions. And what basically happened is that they were notifying that the other party to the agreement that they were not able to deliver on some of the obligations within the agreement. And just to give you examples of this, in Uganda, we had about 9 independent power producers declaring force majeure. In Kenya, there were about 10. And the implication of this is that, you bring uncertainty with respect to supply of electricity. We also have the change in law as measures were undertaken to stem the spread of the COVID pandemic across populations. A number of regulations were enacted by the governments in the different jurisdictions. And some of these included restricting the movements of the operators. It included also the curfews where beyond certain hours, no activity was expected to be undertaken. So if some of these regulations were impacting on the operations of these operators, then they have within their mandate to ask for change in law that comes with repercussions, including being compensated for the losses that have occurred as a result of them not being able to deliver as required. A number of speakers have already spoken about this. So globally, we've seen reduction in energy demand. We've also seen increase in energy losses, but also a reduction in the revenue collection from the sales of electricity. And just to give you the African perspective is that whereas people were ordered to work from home, our experience was that even when people were working from home, their consumption of electricity was less than the pre-COVID times. And the reason as why this was is that people tend to rethink their household budgets in terms of uncertainty surrounding the incomes for the following periods. So what happens is that they have to rethink some of the things they have to cut out from their budgets. So one of the quick things that they can cut out from the budgets is the consumption or the expenditure on energy. So we saw that actually for the households, the consumption reduced, and it also happened for all the other customer categories that are served with electricity. However, the rebounding happened quite swiftly. As the economies were being reopened, we saw quite a rebounding that was faster than we expected. So there is some peculiar or unique things about the African setting that we are learning from this pandemic. But one of the things that will become more clear as we go on is the take-or-pay clauses that we have in the power purchase agreements. And I think the permanent shift that will we shall see going into the future is that the governments will try to rethink some of these clauses. And I think you've read about the experiences in Ghana. Kenya has also done this, where they are moving from the take or pay to take and pay. So rather than purchasing power or paying for power that is not utilized, they'll move to purchasing or paying for power that they're actually going to use. Also, we've seen a number of speakers speak about the reliability of electricity supply. So as you impose restrictions on movement of persons, the distributors are not able to respond to faults on the network as soon as and practically as they can. And that leads to a reduction in the reliability of the supply of electricity. We've also seen distributors taking on their rights within the licenses, where they can declare force majeure and claim for additional costs that they've incurred as a result of implementing regulations that require them, for example, to provide sanitary washing equipment and also provide for their employees necessary equipment to work from home. So that includes the purchase of laptops or the purchase of data services that they can use to continue working from home. We've also seen that, as Arnaud pointed out, the impact, a very big impact on the access agenda, as we try to chase the universal access as laid out in the SDG 7. We've seen that one of the quicker things that were done by governments was to reallocate funds that were geared towards supporting connections in the African region towards the more essential services given the times. So money was allocated from electricity to the health services. If we could move on to the next slide. So in terms of the future, what we see is that there is need to intervene in terms of the impact that will happen on the tariff. So as that operators submit the applications for political force majeure, part of the applications include adjustment of the tariff. So you need to have within your policies physical support that will help to reduce the impact on the tariff. We've also seen government responding in terms of providing favorable policy frameworks. So you give a window where the operators or the customers are excused from meeting the obligations as required in the law. So you kind of provide convenient environment where, say, the bills that are incurred by the customers are paid at a later time when they are able to do that. We also see in the future that there will be a need to renegotiate and restructure some of the debt that was incurred in putting up the electricity infrastructure. So if the demand has gone down and the revenues from sale of electricity are not sufficient to meet the requirements in terms of debt obligations, then there is need to rethink in terms of the payment structure, so that the lenders are not seen to, I mean, that the borrowers are not seen to be defaulting on the obligations. There is also need to think about the economic stimulus that can kickstart the economies. And one of the things that was discussed earlier on was whether electricity is an enabler, or it can also along the way participate in the recovery of the economies. Our belief is that electricity is such a crucial enabler in terms of economic recovery, but also during the times of the pandemic, because the hospitals and all the other services do require electricity. So it's a very great enabler in terms of keeping the economies alive. And as Anand, as I conclude, Anand spoke about the solar systems being the new king in Africa. And I think part of that will be the off-grid systems. So as we extend out the grid and also embark on putting up power pools across the regions in Africa, the East African power pool, the West African power pool, we also need to think about the off-grid systems that are going to reach certain populations that will not be able to access the national grids. And this is going to be critical in achieving the access agenda. So as I conclude, and in summary, what I need to say is that the COVID pandemic has brought to us effects that we see our term as short-term, including the reductions in the demand, increase in the cost, but also there are mid-term effects that will come as the pandemic continues to roll out, and this will include tariff increments that the regulators will need to think about in terms of affordability, but also there will be long-term effects. One of the things that we see is that the cost of debt is going to increase as the lenders rethink the risk profile. So one of the things that we see, and Africa has got such huge needs in terms of investments, as Anand talked about. For example, Uganda needs about $5.5 billion if it's going to achieve the universal access targets. But as lenders go through this period, they're going to rethink the risk profiles, and we see that the cost of debt is going to increase. Thank you, and that is the end of my presentation.
So Micheal and Arnaud, thank you very much. I just have a first question to Arnaud Rouget. In terms of electrification rate, we have seen that there is an increase of people not connected to grid. Do we have a figure in terms of electrification rate because the population is still increasing? So if you make the rate may be worse than the figure presented?
Yeah, exactly. You have two ways of looking at this issue. It can be on the electrification rate or on the number of people not connected. So in the case of African electrification rate, it is at 55%, meaning that 45% of the population, or 600 million, are not connected. But of course, there are big discrepancies. If you look at another scope, which would be Sub-Saharan Africa without South Africa, so maybe some consistent area, this rate would be lower, and with big differences between urban and rural areas. In this region, you would have 75% electrification rate in urban areas, but only 25% on rural areas. And as you mentioned, Yvan, the aim is to deploy access programs and to make connections on a pace which is higher than the population growth.
Okay, I have a question for both of you. If I make a summary of what you said, interest rates are growing, electrification programs are relying on heavy investment, and then there is a huge development of solar with off-grid site. Is there a risk that one day the national grid will have not enough tariff to cover the fixed cost? And this is a vicious circle. This is to say that the interconnected system is too expensive and the off-grid system is less expensive. So is there a shift in the development scheme and the access to electricity in Africa, in your views, that has been accelerated by COVID because of interest rate, because of solar development, and because of problem of recovering cost on the connected grids?
If I may make a first point, this issue is already very critical, but not related so much to solar development. If you look at a country like Nigeria today, due to unreliability of the grid supply, you have a huge number of individuals or companies who heavily rely on backup diesel generator. We estimate there is almost 40 gigawatts of installed capacity in Africa, so as much as all the hydropower dams in Africa in backup generators. So this issue already exists. And I think that the COVID-19 crisis may exacerbate some challenges for the utilities, for grid expansion. But our view is that, of course, there are big financial issues, as you mentioned. If utility is not cost reflecting, and if people are relying on backup generator or private sector, this will not improve the ability of the utility to finance. But our view is that countries need to deploy integrated strategies, making the most of each technology, grid expansion, densification, mini grid, solar home system. And you have interesting examples where the government is able to coordinate all that, for example, in Zambia or in Togo. Micheal, over to you if you have more Ugandan perspective.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to begin this from the perspective of the subsidies that are provided to the electricity sector within the African region. One of the things that I may have to point out is that given the latest data, there are only about 2 jurisdictions that have cost-reflective tariffs. That means that most of the African continent, there is need for subsidization from the central government in order to provide electricity. So what that means that if there is a reallocation of resources by central government, then it's going to become more expensive or to meet the costs of supplying electricity. So what happens for the other jurisdictions where there is cost reflectivity is that they've tended to be more resilient in terms of recovery, and in terms of pricing going to the future, we do not really see that the national grid will become more expensive compared to the off-grids. Our experience in Uganda specifically is that the off-grids have been more expensive. However, as we see the equipment, especially for solar, the prices going down, this may come to parity and or possibly be lower than the national grid. However, the question of the subsidization within the electricity sector is very important to give a comprehensive response to your question.
Okay, Micheal. Micheal, Arnaud, I still have one more question, but I will keep it for the panel because this is a more general question about the force majeure clauses in PPA. And I think this is not only for Africa, but also for other countries. Thank you very much. We'll see in the panel at the end of the webinar. And now this is time to go on other energy fields. It's LNG, so liquefied gas. And there will be a presentation from Tony RAGEN. So I hope I don't pronounce your name like a former president of the United States, but I think this joke has been done to you so much times that you don't count anymore. So Tony RAGEN, he actually is the leader of Nexant gas and LNG activity in Asia, and he has a huge career in LNG with Shell International, NSP Global. So I'm not sure I can present your whole career, and the best thing to do is to leave you the floor to present us what happened in the LNG sector.
Thanks, Ivan. So very quickly, Nexant, who are we? We're consultants just focusing on the energy and the chemical sector. And then we're unusual in that we offer both technical and commercial services. So we cover.
I think we cannot. We only see the Windows screen.
Exactly, we can see your desktop only. So if you can open the PPT with the slideshow mode, that would be nice.
Sorry.
Or if you want, I can also present it, whatever is better.
Okay, I've opened it in slideshow mode. Is that okay?
No, we can't see it. All right, in this case, yeah, we cannot see it. I will do it for you, and you just tell me when to move on. Just give me 1 second.
Okay.
Can you see it well?
For me, it's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, so Nexant, we're consultants to the energy and chemical sector. I cover most of the energy sector from lubricants to hydrogen, but focus in particular on gas and LNG. Hence, I'm the guy now talking to you about the impact of COVID on the LNG markets. Next slide. Okay, so better also describe what these markets are first of all. So very, very quickly, LNG is still a very Asia-centric business, and so in the green blob we've got the Asian demand. The other area of demand is Europe, and then there's relatively little demand. There's some demand, but relatively little from North and South America and the Middle East, but very much an Asian market. Supply, Australia is the largest producer, so you've got their Asia Pacific there as a very significant supply source. Then the Middle East, Africa, which is particularly Nigeria and Algeria, but several other countries as well. And then the US is coming in as a significant LNG supplier. So that's a quick, put it in perspective, look at the market. Now let's go on to the next slide. Oh, sorry, I should also mention, just again to put it in perspective, so we got there global LNG demand, 365 million tons last year. And then the supply capacity, the liquefaction capacity, about 485 million tons at the end of the year. And I mentioned that because I'll be making some comparisons a little later. Now, here's a sort of quick summary, really, of my presentation. Do not try and read it. It's far too small print. And I'm not going to work my way through it. What we will be doing is after this, we'll be circulating a full presentation. And so that will show you a lot more data and background information on the slides that I'll be presenting. And so my presentation will really just be the highlights from this bigger pack. So next slide. Okay, so again, a big picture, global LNG demand, it's still going up. So it increased in 2020 despite the pandemic. The growth rates were significantly less than the previous year. So on the right-hand side, you'll see, a growth rate of, I think, about 3.5% last year. So way behind the growth rates that we've seen over the last 3 years. So continued growth in demand, but at a slower rate than in previous years. Next slide. Now, looking at the sort of key components, we'll look first of all at LNG production. And so what this slide shows is that over the last few years, we've seen a very rapid increase in LNG production, LNG supply. That supply was actually running ahead of demand, which started to depress prices. And then in Q1 of 2020, we had record supply. And then comes along the pandemic, and so very quickly the producers had to rein back supply, but were fairly slow in doing that. But we did see a drop in supply in Q2, and a more significant drop in supply in Q3, and then a pickup in Q4. But the lower supply came about not because producers were shutting in trains or capacity. Initially, it was because a lot of customers cancelled some of their US cargoes, so that reduced US exports. And then we had a whole string of unscheduled shutdowns in plants around the world, Australia, Malaysia, Trinidad, a whole lot. So those unscheduled shutdowns also reduced supply, and so those were the prime reason that supply dropped, not because producers had to shut down trains, shut down plants. So put it another way, the pandemic did not significantly impact production. Next slide. Yep, that must be the demand slide. Okay, so we see the demand really peaking in Q1 of 2020, and then coming off quite significantly in Q2 and Q3. That was mainly a reflection of a significant drop in demand of gas demand in Europe. Elsewhere, we saw relatively minor changes in demand. In China, certainly a significant dip in February, but a very strong hockey stick recovery from that. And so we saw a fairly rapid recovery in demand, and that one of the reasons was that the low gas prices that we saw last year stimulated new demand, and so we had Indian refiners rushing out to buy LNG because it was cheaper than naphtha, and so those low oil prices stimulated demand, whilst the pandemic destroyed some demand, but that was primarily in Europe. And end year, we end up with global demand being almost 3% higher than in 2019. So again, the pandemic has not had a significant effect on demand. It was just very short term.
Okay.
Next slide. Okay, now we have a lot of new liquefaction capacity under construction at the moment, over 100 million tons, so a lot. And so, you know, one thing one should look at is, are these projects, were these impacted by the pandemic? And therefore, are we going to see long delays before these plants are completed? And potential supply shortage in 2025? No. Yes, we saw some lockdowns at some construction sites, but very brief. And so, no, we did not see a pandemic having a significant effect on the progress of these projects that are under construction. No more so than the delays that we would normally see in projects under construction. So again, no impact really from COVID-19 on all the liquefaction projects under construction. Next slide. Pricing. So yes, we did see a significant impact on pricing, or did we? Yes, certainly prices dropped, but was that necessarily just due to the pandemic? So on this slide, we've got a blue line there, that's Brent, and then the other two lines are typical gas market prices. So there's UK NBP and Platts JKM, Japan Korea market for Asia. And so, yeah, we saw then, as we'll all, I'm sure, recall, dramatic drop in oil prices, Brent in particular, following the start of the pandemic. But those gas prices have been coming down, well, they've been coming down for the last 18 months or so. And that was because of the supply overhang, the extra supply coming into the market. And so the pandemic didn't really result in significant drop in prices. All it did is it just exacerbated the situation, and then those gas prices fell lower than they probably would have otherwise. And we hit record lows of both MVP and JKM. that we've seen we saw a very rapid recovery in crude prices. There you see a classic V-shaped recovery. And then after a bit of a pause, so the gas spot prices sort of plateaued for about a quarter, then started the recovery, but a very quick recovery at the end of the year. And so we have this very odd, unique situation where both the Place JKM and the MVP hit record lows in April of 2020, and then JKM hit a record high in January 2021. And so, yes, the pandemic did have some impact on prices, but it was not the main reason for the fall. It just exacerbated the fall. And we have seen a recovery in the latter part of the year in those key gas market prices.
Okay, Tony.
Next slide. Yes.
This is the end. Last slide.
Right, then I will skip this one because you pick that out. One more slide. Okay, because this is the important one. This is where COVID did have an impact. And so, I've told you about 100 million tons under construction. And at the beginning of 2020, this is the list of projects that said, projects under development, and we're going to sanction our project in 2020, 2021. A massive list, which would, if they'd gone ahead, it would result in a huge supply overhang. Massive. We're talking about the equivalent of about 50% of current liquefaction capacity. But fortunately, the pandemic burst this bubble. So instead of all these companies taking FID last year, only one company did, and that's Sempra, and that's Energy Costa Azul in Mexico. And so it's burst this overhang bubble. Projects haven't been cancelled, but they have been held back, and so they're much slower moving to FID. We had 6 projects taking FID in 2019 and only 1 last year. And then, this year, it'll probably only be 2 or 3. So this is actually a much more sustainable path than was being proposed at the beginning of 2020, when it looked as if we're going to sanction a vast amount of overcapacity. So that was one of the good points coming out of the pandemic, and that'll be my last point on this.
Okay, Tony, thank you very much for the presentation on the impact on LNG market. I have one question from the floor from Sama Sabri from Gazreg in Egypt. He's asking whether the LNG market, LNG acts as an arbitrage tool between different zones of price in the world. So has LNG played a huge role during the COVID-19 crisis as a softener of the price shock for the overall gas price, in your view?
Well, price shock, well, yes, it's lowered LNG prices. Arbitrage, that's interesting because what we have, I was talking about all this sort of excess supply, and in 2019 in particular, a lot of that was then almost dumped into Europe, where we have a lot of storage. But then quite a bit of it was re-exported, particularly when we saw the window opening between Europe and Asia. And I haven't seen the figures yet, but that window really opened very wide at the end of 2020. So I would expect to see substantial re-exports from Europe out back to Asia. No, it didn't. The pandemic, the lower prices didn't fundamentally change sort of trading patterns, but it did actually, because prices crashed both in Europe and Asia, then it did stop some of these movements from Europe to the US for 6 months or so.
Okay, and I've got another question from Monazaran from GasReg also. They are very active on LNG. How can we explain the sharp V shape in oil price and the U shape more soft for the gas sector? In your view, what is the rationale between the difference of shape between the two price curves?
Because Brent is far more actively traded, and so once we saw the Brent prices start to decline sharply, and then all the short sellers leapt in there and drove prices down to about $9, so ridiculously low levels. I think WTI into negative territory, and so that was clearly overdone. And so people then had to cover those positions, and so then we saw a recovery, and so it was really perhaps an overreaction by traders pushing the price way down, and then people having to cover those slump positions, and so prices then started to come up again very sharply. So it was because of the sort of extreme, really the tradability of Brent, and people were rather actively trading Brent and right down to $9. Whereas gas, we're reflecting more of the fundamentals, and so prices recovered when we saw demand recover.
Okay, so oil gas are more irrational than gas people.
Well, actually, what we've seen here is actually there was more volatility in gas spot prices. Just when you saw that huge drop in Brent, then it looks as if it was Brent, but spot gas prices were actually more volatile last year.
Okay. Tony, thank you very much for your presentation. So now we are coming back to electricity with Pierre BRAUN. So Pierre is the lead advisor for investment in Eurelectric, which is the European Association of Electricity Industry. And he has held several positions as a European Affair Advisor, or would I say so? He is the guys from Europe in the electricity sector. Is a pathway to Europe in the electricity sector, to say it shortly. And he will make a presentation about the impact of the COVID-19 on the energy sector, and more specifically, if I'm not telling too much about your presentation, Pierre, the fact that in your view, COVID-19 will accelerate energy transition and then electrification of the global energy system. Pierre, the floor is yours. It's up to you.
Thank you very much. Can you see adequately my screen?
Perfect.
Perfectly. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Really happy to be here. So my name is Pierre BRAUN. I'm an investment lead at Eurelectric. So Eurelectric is the
Sorry, just a second. Right now we can't see the full screen version. Please click on the three dots under your slide. Or yes. there is and you will be able to select the hide presenter view mode. Thank you very much.
Okay. Can you see it more my slide correctly in full screen now?
No, this is also in editing mode. So if you can start the slideshow mode, that would be nice. I guess you are using two screens, so let's try it right now. If not, then I will be able to share it. My screen.
Yeah, well, let me, sorry for struggling with the
I can do it if you want.
Pierre, yes, Pierre, perhaps Aniko will take the lead for the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure. Just give me 1 second. We can just go on, and in the meantime, I'm doing it.
Sure. So working at Eurelectric, so the European Trade Associations of the electricity industry. So we representing generation, distributions, and the retailers. And I'm here today. So a lot of really interesting things has been said today about the impact of COVID on the electricity sectors. And here I would like to give you more what's the perspective from the European utility side, and what opportunity and needed tool we see in the COVID-19 aftermath to speed up basically the transition and the electrifications. So few remarks. So the first of all is that we've seen that electricity has played a crucial role basically to fight against COVID, to power the hospitals and essential services. There has been also an important element to grasp is that the European electricity utilities have been put to test, that they have reacted quite fastly to protect the operations and then to guarantee the security of supply, which has not been put into danger. And that also together with government, they have put in place some schemes to basically facilitate the payments of bills by customers with stretched liquidity, but also to make sure that the entire supply chain, so basically the suppliers, at the financial sustainability level. Yet we have seen that this has put a test. We have seen that there have been a decrease in the wholesale prices. There have also been an impact on the revenues of the companies because of the government measures, because of the drop in electricity demand, which put basically some question about the financial ability of all utility to perform and to further invest, to drive the investment level further into the energy transitions. And of course, the ambition is really dependent of the financial health of utilities. That's why we see basically that the role that we need the adequate tools to be further designed to allow basically to strengthen the ability of a utility to further invest in the energy transition and decarbonizations. But also we see that economic stimulus package must prioritize electrifications and the investments in a different area. And we see a clear role in the public, from the public sectors to mitigate at the short term, basically some risk and show the way forward in investing in different areas such as renewable energy, EV infrastructures, distribution grid reinforcement, for instance. Moving on to the next slide, and here going on more into the details of what does it mean, so what impacts could we already foresee. First of all, we foresee that the power demand might take some time to recover to pre-crisis level at a moment where we need to increase the electrification and accelerate in the movement. We see as well that we have seen that there have been a shift in power generations with a major role, according to the European Commission last figures. We see that solar and renewables have taken a greater share in the EU power mix, which is quite a new record. And we also see, and the good news is that the power sector is on track for a double-digit annual reduction in CO2 emissions. The question is it a structural shift or is it just temporary due to the decrease of demand? The other main learning we could see is that there is a risk of underinvestment situations for many reasons. The first reason is the economic downturn, which gives limited perspective on the growth and the power demand growth. The second is we see that, of course, there have been a decrease of revenues and decrease of prices that have been sharpened to the wholesale prices, which were already low, have been sharpened due to the COVID crisis, and that could be a long-term effect. So have an impact on the ability of revenues and for investors. And the thing is that we see that the downturn on investment is not really simple to grasp because it's really impact different market segments. On the generation side, we see that there have been, so the EIA have forecasted that there have been a drop generally in Europe energy investment of 17%. But this impact has been less observed in renewables, mainly because of the market schemes and because most of the projects were already committed and because the revenues were already safeguarded. Yet there might be a risk in the futures whether the new project basically will be the same because perhaps the financial strength of government support schemes might be limited. And here I'm coming to my last point is also the ability of a different country to absorb basically the economic shocks. The impact is not the same across the country in Europe, and at the moment where basically the ability, the public sectors has a key role to play to support or at least to de-risk in some investments, especially in the demand side. A recent EIB report has shown that they expect that the investment will be more impacted on the demand side, so energy efficiency, renovation of buildings, but also infrastructures, exactly the investment area where we expect an increased electrification. We see that also as well that we ahead of us, we have massive needs to meet the decarbonization targets and the new Green Deal objectives. At Eurelectric, we have modelized what do we need to achieve the net zero economy, and we estimated that just for generation and storage, we will need around 100 billion to be invested per year. And in a more recent study as well, that's for infrastructure, so basically for distribution grids, we estimated that around 34 billion needs to be invested into the next decade, which is a significant increase by 50 or 70%. And also the question is whether how do we finance these investments in a context where, for instance, if you take the grid investments, the capacity for the economies to absorb it or to increase the tariff is already limited. Moving on to the next slide, we have seen that yet we need to speed up the electrifications. And here on this slide, you see, I mean, what do we need to achieve a net zero economy? In the blue line, you have the current trend. So where we are right now, you will see that in the recent year, the electrification rates at European level has been quite stagnant. In green, you see what do we need to achieve a 95% of decarbonization of the economy by 2045. The other scenario, needed electrification scenario, shows that is estimated for 80% of total decarbonization. So we see that for the moment, we are not on the trend, I mean, to decarbonize if you take at the long-term view. So this means that for doing that, and moving into to the next slide, we need to speed up the electrification and energy transitions, and we need a comprehensive visions between market designs, policy, ambitious policy, and adequate tools to further invest. So first of all, we need to remove the barriers for renewables developments, because the capacity, we foresee that the capacity of renewables should increase by 4 between the next decade, so they need to be deployed and to be installed quickly. We need to address the permitting rules and make the fact that this project need to be deployed more fastly, and address as well the social acceptance, basically not only for renewables, but also for the infrastructures. We also need to electrify faster the transport sectors, which has a strong growth rate in terms of electricity demand. For instance, we need to deploy the number of charging point deployment need to increase by 20 in the next decade. Also, we need to take into account the renovation of buildings and electrification of buildings. And here the renovation waves and different investment plan announced by the Commission will play a significant role. And last but not least, we need to prepare the grids and the infrastructures to facilitate this increased electrification and renewable penetration, which means, so we need to increase the investment, we need also to deploy the adequate regulatory framework pertaining to the planning, the execution, the financing and remuneration of system operators. Now, what can we do, and what's the role of different what are the tools that we have at hand? So moving on to the next slide, we see a great role for the public spending at that moment. So the recovery programs, and the one which has been announced by the European Commission, and the major and landmark deal that has been agreed by the European Council, so to set up recovery funds to boost the energy and digital transition, is much welcome, because we definitely think that this recovery program should speed up the decarbonization and electrifications, both on a supply side, so meaning investing more in network infrastructure, storage and flexibility, but most importantly, the demand side, so further participate to the electrification of the transport, buildings and industrial sectors. So we see that significant amount of public money will be invested, made available in the next 3 years. But the main challenge is to identify and allocate the right the funds to the right clean energy project that will deliver EU decarbonization objective and electrification in the most cost-efficient way on time. So to do that, we have recommended several recipes for the success of these decarbonization objectives. First of all, we need to prioritize investments that deliver the most climate and economic benefits, And an interesting study of the Oxford University last year showed that actually we need to prioritize investment in infrastructures, in mobility, but also into the renovation of buildings. This fund, of course, should respect the additionality principle. So they should finance a project that would not have been materialized otherwise. It's important to say that we need to preserve as well the market integrity and make sure that we do not disturb too much the markets and the ability of investors to predict and drive projects. Of course, public sectors can play a really important role to de-risk and to bear and to fill in the investment gaps in this uncertain time. And of course, what's more important is to make sure that these recovery funds, that we avoid any cherry picking and we stay coherent with the Green Deal and also with all the frameworks that have been patiently built the recent years. So basically the clean energy package, the national energy and climate plans, but also all new instruments that are coming into the pictures, which are going to finance the transition, such as the just transition plans, for instance. The big challenge here is how do we identify the good project in very limited time, and how do we match it with very long lasting. So the investment, basically, we're going to decide are going to last for the next 30 years. How do we make sure to decide in the time of injustice, because we need to disburse this investment, but how do we identify them and make it match with our decarbonization objective? Last, now I'm finishing my presentation. So let's not forget as well, basically the role of market design. So yes, the recovery funds and public spending will play a major role, but we also need to design the right toolbox for the investors to invest and to boost these investments. Some efforts, some risk can be managed by the investors, but there is some risk that they cannot be, that could be managed by the market design. And we need this consolidated toolbox. So first of all, we need to get the market signals and policy signal right to facilitate the large-scale reallocation of private capital to carbon neutral generation and enabling the technologies. That's the role basically of the sustainable finance and taxonomy, which play a key role and send the right signals. At the same time, we need to act on all the levers and develop an integrated vision. We need also an ambitious and predictable carbon pricing and taxation regime. We need to give the investors the right visibility of how much will be the return and when. It's also important for the customers. If we want the customers to further invest in electricity, we need to stop penalizing them and remove the taxes basically that basically are on the customer sides. And that's why I think that's going to be tackled in the next revision and taxation directive. Also, we need complementary mechanisms basically to be considered to mitigate political and regulatory risks on the long term. Because with the decreasing wholesale prices, basically, it's really difficult for any promoters or investors basically to invest upfront huge amount of capital up to 3 years. So perhaps it's time basically to also come forward with new instruments that allow and give investors more predictability beyond the current mechanism that we have in place. And more importantly, we need to implement further the clean energy package and go for further integration of towards European energy markets. And last but not least, let's not forget about a network tariff regulation, because infrastructures will be the enabling tools of electrification and renewable penetrations. And there is some change that we expect. We need to allow DSO to invest more into electrification, but also to give the right signal to customers and all stakeholders along the value chains. Thank you very much. I'm done now and looking forward for your question.
Okay, Pierre, thank you very much for this plaidoyer for this electricity. The world will be brighter with electricity. Then I got one question from Xaba Moses from Hungary. Is just asking whether the drop in the energy investment is related to the COVID-19 crisis or to the change of regulation, or would say rules between renewables and non-renewables. What's your view?
Well, it's really difficult, I mean, to answer to the question for the moment. I think we don't have now the clear view of where the investment went. We see that the energy and the renewables investment resisted quite well due to the COVID and due to the fact that they are the support scheme and all the projects were already committed. But what we see is that it's becoming more challenging to invest in other in the demand side, basically. So in the electrification of demand, where the market's perspective, I mean, are nascent, basically, and where the government support is really important as well. So what we would like, the main message we would like to pass on is, yes, the public support is needed, but we need to define maybe the long-term, to have the long-term perspective and define the right framework to allow and to attract the private capital into the right technologies.
And I've got another question: is the required investment in production and grid is around 135 billion euro per year. This is roughly the GDP of Greece. Do we have a figure on the equipment side for housing, for transportation? What is the global bill of electrification per year? Do we have a figure roughly?
Well, we haven't these figures at hand for the moment. That's going to be something that, of course, I think it's really depending as well on the strategy of different countries and electrification strategy, of course. It's also going to depend mostly, I mean, on the prices of electricity. So the cheaper, I mean, you get electricity, I mean, the more, I mean, you intend to electrify further. Now, I would say we don't have the total bill basically for it, because it's really, we need to take into account that European countries have very diverse strategy, different electrification rates already ongoing. And so, for instance, the electrification rate of France is not the same than, for instance, Spain or Denmark. So we need to take this diversity into account. And yeah, hopefully the figures I've presented to you, I mean, they should be cheaper in the future as long as we are able to reap up the efficiency gains.
Okay. Okay, since that's for all, for you, Pierre, for your presentation. So we will now have the panel discussion. So I will ask all the panelists to enter the room or to enter the arena. So to switch on their camera. Okay, Tony is joining us. Perhaps the other one, Bart, David. Okay. So waiting for them to join us. I think I will have 3 questions. The first question has been arising from several questions from the floor. They were asking whether 2019 was a good reference to check the COVID-19 crisis. So the first question is, has the COVID-19 crisis, in your view, had a real strong impact on the energy market? Or is it just a small or, I would say, a non-structural problem for the energy market? It's a little shock since the energy market can absorb without problem. I would like to ask a question first to Bart and to David, and then perhaps Pierre and Tony. Bart, is this a problem, the shock of the COVID-19 in the energy market in terms of demand and price?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think that overall the impact on the electricity demand, I mean, it is unprecedented, right? Because we look at a negative electricity demand growth, which doesn't, happen. And I think Julia showed very well that there's an unprecedented shock. But the impact on power prices, I think, David, you already showed, right? That probably the -5%, on where if prices are set on an hourly basis, it does not necessarily drive the price setting that much. However, and I think that Tony also addressed it very well, I think that we are seeing that the key fundamental drivers for power prices are also, aspects like gas prices, CO2 prices, gas potentially linked to oil and LNG markets. And I think that we have seen that they have been very volatile. Now, I think that Tony also talked about, whether that is then related to the COVID pandemic. And so what I've heard is that probably on oil prices, I think that Tony were quite clear on the V shape, but probably on the gas price level, probably that was already related to the oversupply situation, you know, and only probably a bit exaggerated by COVID. So, so overall, I would be saying that on power price level, you know, the COVID impact is probably quite limited compared to the other drivers, you know, we're seeing in power markets.
So, David, what's your view on the closing of pub in England and the reopening of pub in England? I just noticed that it was a very, very good sign of change in our way of life in England, but also in France. We call them café here. David, I think your microphone is mute. Still mute.
Okay, sorry, it said I was muted by the organizer. Yeah, so you know, I very much agree with Bart's assessment of the situation. The demand itself is not really driving the impact upon the prices, but it's really the other fundamentals like the gas prices, like the CO2 prices, and of course the year-on-year increase in renewable shares. So with regards to the question of is 2019 a good representation of what 2020 looks like, well, we're in a position at the moment where there is so much change in the markets, that the markets are so dynamic in terms of increasing renewable share, the increase in prices and things like carbon. I mean, from 2018 we saw huge impact in carbon pricing, which completely shifted the merit order of the units that are being dispatched in the market, and therefore the technology mix is fundamentally shifting within markets. So I would say that 2019 is as good a comparison as we can take for 2020, but it's very difficult, I think, in any year-on-year comparison to really benchmark the behavior of the market against the previous year.
Okay, Tony, Pierre, if you have any additional comment on this on this analysis, it's not the argument, but
LNG market. Yeah, the LNG market did continue to grow in 2020 versus 2019, despite COVID. But I think the point I'd like to make is what had more impact on the LNG market, it wasn't COVID, it was the weather. You know, I know I'm English and we always talk about the weather, but don't forget we had this polar vortex hitting northern climes over this winter. And so we had an unusually cold winter, particularly in Northeast Asia. And that had much more impact on LNG demand and prices than COVID. So, you know, it's the weather rather than COVID that's impacting us.
On Pierre?
Yeah, maybe just to complement, I fully agree. I mean, what you has been already said, just to say that it has maybe confirmed a tendency that we already said, I mean, on the wholesale power prices, basically, that we're driving down because of further integration and penetration of renewables. And I think what would be interesting to show is what have been the further impact, whether it's really a systemic shift. I think it's just showing that, it could have an impact on the revenues and the way, I mean, investment decision will be made, pertaining also to the capacity of governments to maintain subsidy or like support schemes to provide to mitigate basically this volatility, which remain, I think, one of the main issue and would be the trend, I think, in the future years.
Okay. Thank you. I just have another question. So let's say that energy market and energy market structure are significantly affected by COVID-19. I have the feeling that regulators and public state have taken emergency measures, which have been quite successful because the energy market has not been did not collapse. The energy system did not collapse. So we could have the feeling that everything is fine and we don't have to change anything in our way of regulating the energy market. So the question for all of you would be, what would be your main advice, your main recommendation to regulators to address this shift in the energy market structures that we have seen to renewables, a drop in the coal system, an electrification, a need for electrification, and also a need for grid resilience. What would be, if you have one advice to say to the regulators?
I think that really one of the key issues at the moment is, and it's not something that we've really talked about in the context of this discussion, but it's really more in the area of the use of storage technologies. And so, you know, we saw a number of years ago that there was, you know, an influx in incentives within markets to get renewables into the mix. But we've not necessarily seen the same type of incentives in order to back storage technologies. So we're seeing issues, you know, again, going back to the GB market. If you look at what's been happening over the past 1 to 2 months, we're seeing power prices consistently persisting at around about £4,000 per megawatt hour during the evenings where the PV is dropping off, and then you have this need for flexibility of assets which are old and are slow to ramp up. So you're getting periods around the sort of the 6-7 p.m. where the system is really struggling to be able to cope with that large amount of renewable penetration and that increase in the residual demand curve. So I think that from a regulator standpoint, in terms of looking at being able to balance the systems and how we move forward, I think that really one of the key issues is around the stimulating investment in storage technologies.
Okay, Bart, what would be your?
Yeah, I think on the regulation side, for instance, the Singapore example showed how important it is that businesses can respond, right? So that they have the flexibility to adapt to change, right? And so market design is of course critical with relation in relation to that, and while still giving security to businesses going forward. So I think it is very important that regulators have another look at the design of the markets and also in relation to network operators, right? So the regulated assets that the regimes are flexible enough to cope, and then flexible means from a business standpoint, from a commercial standpoint, to deal with changes. And I think that also this morning, we saw quite some examples of difficulties. As a matter of fact, I think the presentation from Turkey was excellent, with regard to that. So it is very important that regulators, look at what businesses would need, so that they can deal with, abrupt changes.
Tony from Singapore. We just spoke about Singapore.
Well, yes. So what was very impactful, so we saw, a crash of oil and gas prices, and then very shortly afterwards, major companies, Shell, BP, ExxonMobil, having to take huge write-offs. And when announcing those, they took the opportunity to talk a little bit about the future, and the point they made was that post-pandemic, we're not going to be coming back to business as normal, and so it's actually accelerated the energy transition. It's accelerated the desire to move to net zero, and they're now outlining their strategy to achieve that, etc. So possibly industry is now moving a little faster than regulators. So regulators perhaps now need to look and see whether they are really enabling, facilitating, encouraging the transition, rather than perhaps slowing it down.
Pierre, this was the last point of your presentation, but as I squeezed you due to time, perhaps you can develop a little bit what would be your main advice to regulators for addressing the structural shift of the energy market.
So yeah, thank you. So first of all, I think it's just to act on two main points. So first of all, the investability of the power sectors, and how do we act and we enable the ability of basically private investors, but also utilities, to further invest. And here the question of market design and long-term proximity is key. because if you're not able to mitigate the policy risk or basically in risk that investors cannot mitigate, I think the regulation has this role to do that. And if not, this would result in increased cost of capital. We have seen, in Africa, in the very good presentation in Africa, that despite you have a decrease in cost of technologies, most of the uncertainty remains, and at the end, the investment is still costly, and it will not be feasible for every country to do that. So that's the first thing. So perhaps try to think about like how do we address this volatility of the market's prices and revenues over 3 years, considering huge capex that will need to be invested in the current years, and also how do we attract this huge amount of capital that are available today, but are not shifted correctly and are timely towards the energy transitions. So that would be the first things, and then maybe the second will be more, how do we regulators can flexibly incentivize network system operators, but also send the right signals for further investment in regulated assets, and make sure that, of course, it's remain cost efficient, but also how we get enough flexibility to trials and also to deploy more fastly the investments. And the last but not least, I would say general remarks about how do we deploy the investment faster. So addressing the issue of permitting, it's apply for renewables, but also for network, for any type of big projects, and addressing the social acceptance, which is a type of risk basically that it will be increasingly mounting and has an impact on the lead time, which ultimately has an impact on the pace of transition.
Okay, I have a last question for all of you. There is a tendency that due to low interest rate, because as of today, risk-free loan interests are very low. So as regulated activities are not very risky, generally speaking, as they are regulated, they are not very risky. There could be a tendency to overinvest in utilities with the risk of stranded assets. So an impact of the COVID-19 could be an overinvestment in utility and in grids. So what would be your feeling about that? Is there really a risk, and this is a risk for the regulator, to see overinvestment due to low interest rate, due to acceleration of the energy transition and so on, in regulated activities like grid and infrastructure? Something. David, Bart, Pierre, Anthony. David? No. So Bart, my is it for you something that could be a real problem in the long term, the overinvestment in regulated activities?
Yeah, so Ivan, so your question is, because of the low interest rate, is there a risk there's over investment which in grid activities which could lead to stranded assets, right?
Yeah.
That's yeah. No, the grid, right? Let's call that the grid, and then from the electricity side, it's always like half of the entire power sector. It's huge, and so what we see, of course, within the DNVGL, we have tremendous experience in looking at the networks, and that there's a tremendous opportunity still to invest, particularly on the distribution side, and of course also on the transmission side. So if you look at the amount of investment requirement in grids, it's hard to believe that there is that you can get into a over investment situation. Of course, you need to look at what you need to invest in, and digitalization, for instance, is one of the key themes. Ensuring there's grids can accept flexibility, so distributed flexibility and so forth, the deployment of EVs, and what have you. So there's a lot of investment requirements. So and then that's of course quite focused on the European markets. I think for Africa you have the same. So it's hard to believe that I think that the regulatory models for returning the investment, they might need to be reviewed very well, so that indeed you're not ending up with stranded assets from that standpoint, but purely from, let's say, a hardware standpoint, investment requirement to enable the transition. It's a huge space, and it's hard to believe that we could run into an overinvestment situation.
Okay. Pierre, perhaps some comments?
Sure. And so I would say it's really depend. I mean, how do you assess what is stranded assets for us? We need to classify. I mean, whether the infrastructure is directly contributing to the decarbonizations and sustainability goals and facilitate basically the direct or indirect electrifications. If you take the recent numbers for the EIA's projection for investments from last year to this year, I mean, the change is massive. And there is a risk, I think there is more risk of underinvestment than overinvestments. The EIA says that perhaps distribution grids will become the Achilles heels of the energy transitions. And we have conducted a study basically to estimate what would be the needs by 2030 for the distribution grids, because they're going to be the key facilitators of electrification of transport, so connect EV, connect renewables, enable customers. And we see that it's not only about digitalization, but it's really also modernize these networks, because some of the networks, half of them will be by 2030 would have reached its limited lifetime. So there is also a consideration to take that we need as well to refurbish the backbones, simply because these grids are gaining increasing roles in the futures. And of course, it's really also depending. I mean, they could be challenged in the way the money is invested, and I think that's the role of the regulators, of course. But there is, I think, a shift. Since we are shifting towards more decentralized systems, we need to reflect this infrastructure change. So, of course, there will be very important to invest in transmissions, but I think the key focus would be in the coming years to the distributions sides.
Okay. Thank you very much to all of you. I think it's now time to go for lunch and for Tony to go for dinner, because Tony is joining us from Singapore. So I would like to thank everybody, all the participants first, who have been brilliant. And I think we have learned a lot through this webinar about, is the COVID-19 crisis really an issue for energy sector? I think yes. And some first consideration about how the regulator should act in the short term. It's done. In the midterm, still pending, and in the long term, a lot of questions have been opened through the presentation. And last, I wanted also to thank ERRA, and I will give the last word to Christina or to ERRA to conclude this webinar by thanking everybody. I think we had a very rich and a very interesting morning, and I hope that everybody who have assisted to this webinar have obtained good information, but also good question, because the question is sometimes the key to have a good information at the end of the road. Thank you very much, and have a nice lunch, have a nice dinner, have a nice breakfast for people in America, and everybody around the world in the big family of energy and the big family of the regulator of energy. With all my heart, I wish you a very, very good day and good month and good year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ivan. On behalf of the ERRA and the ERRA Secretariat, I would like to thank all the panelists, those as well who already left us, for readiness to join this webinar. This is the second edition of our COVID-19 webinar. We did one last year right after the outbreak. So the purpose was here to look back what happened during 1 year. And I really hope we don't need to do one more in 2022 and still struggling with this question. I really hope that within 1 year time, this will be only a bad experience for all of us. So once again, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.